Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us. I have to admit that I was kind of overwhelmed by the number of attendees, or at least the people who registered. So I wanted to say how much I appreciate it and thank you. So let me start sharing the screen. Oh, you know what, if I'll do that, you won't be able to see it, sorry. So I'll do that first and hopefully it will work. Do you see the full screen now, or do you still see the presentation? Okay. So hi, everyone. It's a special webinar because it's going to be me and Misha presenting. And usually we have external experts. So this is kind of unique because it's going to kind of share our personal and professional story. So this is Misha and me, but this webinar starts actually, well, it goes as back as 2008. And I wanted to share a little bit of our personal story. So we met in 2008. In 2010, Misha graduated, and he joined me in Paris when I continued my studies. And we traveled in Europe quite a bit. And then when I graduated in 2012, we went to what we call from here the Far East. We were in 7 countries in just over 5 months. Then in 2014, we got married and moved to Canada. In 2017, we founded Smart Density, and we worked in the sphere of urban design and urban planning. And in 2020, we got our first building. And I'm mentioning it because for the young architects in the audience today, I was curious about these things, how long it actually takes. In 2022, we were honored to receive the Ontario Association of Architects Best Emerging Practice, and this is how our journey kind of evolved. So thank you again for being here. We gave this presentation, or presented this presentation at U of T and University of Calgary and University of Guelph, and it received really warm feedback. So Misha and I thought, let's have a webinar and present this deck, because it is really interesting. And I don't want you to think that because it was created for students, it's really not urban design 101. It's really lessons that we learned in over a decade, and it really professional ideas and concepts that emerged when as part of our work. So we started with 12 lessons in 12 years. And then Misha reminded me that we're actually 14 years together. And when we practiced, 12 years was 12 lessons. It was a very long presentation, so we reduced it a little bit, but we kept the best, I'm telling you. So let's get started. And I want to start with my lesson. What's getting measured is what's easy to measure, not necessarily what's important. And think about all the urban design guidelines and how much we, follow the rules and shadow and numbers of sunlight on the ground. But eventually, urban design, it's really about how we create those great spaces between the built forms of that what is measured. So if we now talking about angular planes and the consequences of these different guidelines, it's not necessarily what affect the most on our cities. And Misha, feel free to kind of, add to my lessons if you will. And you can see here how these, 2 beautiful spaces from Tokyo and Paley Park in New York, how there's really no design guideline that could have quantified it. And yet these are the best places in our cities. This is also my lesson. Travel is the best teacher. And I mentioned how much Misha and I used to travel, just what happens when we have kids in a business, but we did travel a lot, and we were very fortunate that we had that opportunities. And for any young professional, I would advise the same. Your first opportunity, just go and travel. And it is the best teacher, because I didn't study in school the same things that I studied when I traveled. And when you visit cities like, even cities that feel completely foreign to your habitat. So when you go to Europe, you feel it, how different it is from North American cities. And when we were in Seoul, it is foreign to your hometown, you know, but you take those lessons and you say, okay, what is working here? What am I looking at that makes me feel so good about this city, this street, this building? And what did they do that I can take home? And you will be surprised how many of these lessons are actually applicable to your design when you come and think about it. So, Misha.
So number 3 is that the project results from 20% design effort and 80% regulations and institutional momentum. So this image we have, it's just the beginning of the Toronto zoning bylaw, where the about 17 or 18 first pages are just the table of content, just to give kind of some idea of how regulations can look. And of course, there are hundreds of pages of the regulations themselves. And I'll give an example. So in the past, I worked in the Middle East on master planning, and it wasn't a good firm and with well-intentioned clients that wanted to do great stuff. And when working on the design of a new neighborhood, what would happen eventually after a huge amount of hard work that went into it is that the only significant things that were possible to achieve that were better than the status quo is all kinds of add-ons. For example, you would have some kind of linear park or a design feature, a special building, but these things were still very far from the quality of great places that exist, even in the same geographic region. And a big part of it is about working within regulations because they have huge impact on the environment. So it's critical to understand where the limitations are. And a lot of it is not regulations themselves, but also what I call institutional momentum. So it's how everybody who is involved in the project, from owners to consultants to even as a design firm, financial institutions, etc., how they know the way things needs to be done, and they're very hard to change. So it's sometimes possible to push the envelope in a project, but to a very limited extent. So what really makes a difference in the long run is changing the public discourse about how things should be done. And this is the reason it's very important to take a role in public conversation about how we build, and because that's the way we will shape our environment in the future, and the understanding of everybody who's involved, and eventually regulations will follow too. Lesson 4 is that we, and I refer to urban designers here, are a small and self-selecting group. And so it's a very small profession. It's smaller and less diverse in approach than architects or landscape architects or planners and engineers and real estate developers who have more diverse backgrounds. And things that, ideas that are clear cut to us about urbanism or the role of cars in cities and are far from obvious from everybody else, and we can be very foreign even to other professionals. So not to say anything about the general public. So that's why it's important to communicate the most basic things very simply. So instead of, for example, when saying something is sustainable or creates a good street enclosure, we should be able to go into detail to explain why something is a good idea in the most basic terms. But also we need to be aware that in we are an open society, democratic society, and many people would have very opposing views of what is a good way to live. So we can talk about compact cities and car-light living all we want, but what do we do when there are people who think that a 3,000 square foot home is the bare minimum, and there is nothing other than using car for everything? And if we will have something to offer only to a part of the population, it will have a lot of negative impact on our ability to make change, because change requires popular support, it requires sometimes consensus. So we need to think broadly about, be more inclusively in some sense about who our ideas should apply to.
And I want to add to this lesson is that Misha and I, we have two kids, we live in a condo downtown, and we don't own a car. And when in our projects, a lot of our projects, actually, we ask to have zero parking because these projects are steps away from subway stations. And when I present it to the community and I say, this is, I'm not just preaching, I'm not just presenting this design, this is the way I live, and this is the way I believe we are heading towards a more sustainable future. And they don't believe me. They ask me, do you expect us to believe families could live without a car? So I think it always reminds me this lesson that the way we live and think, we are living by example. It's hard sometimes for people to grasp. If you're not proactive, traffic standards will drive the design. And this is a very risky stage at any development, especially when you have, let's say, somewhat larger site that you have like introduced new blocks. Things about drop-offs, radius, turning, the width of the street. When I was working, we had when we were working on larger projects, and we had very passionate discussions with traffic engineers about what the width of the narrowest street should be. We wanted to push it towards 12 meters. They said, no, you can't have anything less than 18 meters. And that is for like the most intimate residential streets we wanted to have. So 18 meters, just to give you an idea, Bloor Street is 20 meters in width. So when we, in urban design, I would say first and foremost, the effect of the width of the street and how you really design something that is pedestrian first and people first design, then the traffic engineer or traffic consultant can come and just kill your vision, kill it. And the width of the street and turning radius and all of that got to do a lot with how urban design eventually is experienced. So this is a very, very important lesson to share. And that will lead us to your next lesson, Misha.
So lesson 6 is that cars don't have to be like shoes. And what I mean by that is that shoes is something you wear every time you go out. And I think we're in the middle of a very interesting change where cars stop being like shoes and can become something more like work boots, something that's, first of all, is not super convenient, but you could take them only when you go to a remote place or you have to move a lot of stuff. And of course, this is the easiest to do in places with very good transit service that has easy access to local amenities and services, where we can have even zero parking. And we often have a self-selecting population who lives there that prefer living without a car. And we work a lot in these places, of course, so there's a lot of interest in that. But I think the most important and also most interesting challenges are in making the car more like a work boot in places that don't enjoy that kind of access to transit. And it is more challenging, but one thing that works well here is that the same things that can make a place better to experience by foot also tend to make it a little less convenient for cars. So it's a kind of virtuous cycle. So I'm calling all of us to focus more on places where dealing with the car is harder, because there are many more of these places than the places where it's easy, and it has the cumulative impact will be very substantial. Lesson number 7 is that green is often actually gray. So when we think about sustainability, there's a lot of focus on visible things like on the shallowest levels, it can sometimes be things that are just literally green, like green roofs or just the amount of open space. And it's not that these things can be useful. But if we have a look at this mall to the left, so it has a green roof, so it helps mitigate the impacts of stormwater runoff and heat island effect. But fundamentally, the mall itself, it depends on people being able to drive pretty far to get to this location and on a very specific form of commerce to be still attractive in many decades. And that the amount of retail that's provided here will be still correct even in a long time, because it's just very hard to adjust and change. And like on the right, it's a street, it's a residential street in Tokyo. It has buildings that are, many of them are also quite ugly, but they're pretty energy inefficient. And there are no large parks in this specific area. And the street doesn't have even sidewalks, it doesn't have street trees, and it doesn't have street furniture. But this area can be sustained for a very long time and very easily because it has such a efficient, it's so efficient to get around here. And the buildings can be adapted to be more energy efficient and nicer. And there is flexibility in use if it's needed. And it achieves the human needs here very well. So when we think about sustainability, we need to think something that if something can be actually sustained for decades or centuries, and often these things are kind of gray.
This is a very Toronto focused lesson. If something is not appropriate in its context, perhaps we need to revisit the context. And I heard this line when I was working on Murphy's Village or Anested's, if you're familiar with one of those names of the same project. And for those of you who are not familiar with the context, it's a major intersection in Toronto, Bloor and Bathurst. There's a subway stop right there, and it's a small master plan, let's say a new block, a new urban block. And a lot of the criticism that I heard, even from, city planners and people in the industry, and especially from the residents of the annex, that it's not appropriate in the context. And when I heard it, I said, we perhaps need to rethink about the context, because we're talking about a neighborhood of low-rise single-family houses. Okay, I wouldn't even say low-rise because it's not low-rise. It's just single-family houses, steps away from a subway station, and the building the design itself is up to 29 stories in height, and like different towers. And you know what? Perhaps it is should have been a complex of mid-rise buildings, and our planning system, this is how it directs growth in a way. So in larger sites, you are allowed to have tall buildings. So I'm not going into that discussion, but I do want to discuss, when people are objecting higher density projects because it's next steps away from single family neighborhood of single family houses, and our planning system also allows these homeowners to dictate what will be on the site. So there's something very wrong in that planning system that's contributed a lot to our housing crisis. So this is my lesson number 8. And the last lesson for this presentation, and I can't see if you posted any questions, but please feel free to do so, is that density is key for the greatest places. And it's part of the reasons why we named our company Smart Density, because we know that, first of all, we are social creatures and we are attracted to places where other people like to hang out. It's the social proof of places. And we cannot speak about, vitality of businesses or the use of infrastructure without the people to really enjoy the infrastructure or businesses, and to help businesses thrive as a result. So we have to have people. And when we have to have people, we have to have density, and it's also a better and more sustainable use of land, which is the resource that we're not growing any more of. So thank you very much for listening to us so far. Let's see, I'll stop sharing. And let me see, I have some question here, Misha, for you. So can you, I don't know if everyone can see that, but can you also share about the other things from Tokyo that you learned? Actually, I can answer that. We also have a video and an article about the zoning in Tokyo. And I don't remember all the details right now, but basically the zoning in Tokyo has 12 levels of zoning. And here in Toronto, just to give you an idea, we have like 25 categories, and each of the 25 categories has like subcategories. So it's a very complex system compared to the zoning system in Tokyo. And the zoning system in Tokyo, for example, even the most restrictive ones allows for residential uses, but also like small commercial. So a small business to support this type of land use. And on top of that, they're not very descriptive in terms of height or build form or setbacks. You have an FSI, they call it FAR, but FSI that you need to achieve. Once you achieve that FSI, so FSI is a ratio of how much you're building in the ratio of the size of the lot. And once you achieve that FSI or FAR, you are good to go. Your building is approved. You're not bounded to very restrictive rules and laws. So try to, I posted it on stories, Toronto stories, and there's also a mini webinar on our YouTube channel. Let's see, I have one more questions. Tips on working with engineering departments who are not willing to give up their standards and then infamous TACC guidelines.
So I think one kind of key here is that you can't in these conditions you usually can't really fight people. You need to find ways to work with them, which is not always easy. So one way is to try to find the people within the department who would be more willing to go beyond and advocate for, or more, we could say, progressive. The other is to try to understand where the objections are coming from, because sometimes it's just about not being familiar with something else and being concerned that you're proposing something that poses risk. And sometimes it will be more benign in the sense that people don't want to kind of go beyond and work, do extra work to do something that's not typical. And this is, in this case, it's really key. It's really helpful to find the people who are willing to push for new ideas, because they'll be willing to do that extra work to support change.
We have another interesting question. Could you please share your views about Southeast Asian urbanism / cities in Southeast Asia, Singapore, Manila, etc.? It's quite different than North American urbanism, and it's mostly driven by a lot of informalities. Sorry, I'm misreading it, but it's actually what makes it more vibrant. So I think, by the way, we did not go to Manila because we are Israeli citizens, and unfortunately, Israeli citizens are not allowed to visit Muslim countries. But we did go to Singapore, and I can tell you, first of all, Singapore is kind of a unique creature in East Asia, because it's much more planned and much more Western than many other cities in East Asia. And Misha, maybe you want to take to answer that question of what you learned. But for me, what I remember from Singapore, and it was 10 years ago, okay, that the unique integration of transit, residential, commercial, and I believe, I don't know, but I know that in Tokyo, for example, transit stations are completely privatized. So as a result, you really create a truly mixed use station, because it's privatized, so the numbers have to work. So you want to create this really everything in one stop kind of an experience. And also the people of Tokyo, 70% of them are using transit daily, and in Toronto the numbers are like 30%. So really, I think it speaks to a lot of our problems. Misha, what else do you want to add?
I wanted to add to that. I think, and again, I've been only to Singapore, but I have some familiarity with that area. And I think one thing that's important is that as these places develop, one of the unfortunate things that's happening is that instead of adapting this the ideas they have and the kind of incremental type of development that patterns they have and other and mixed use approaches, it's usually you would get like whole areas deleted and rebuilt in something that would resemble a 1950s towers in a park neighborhood. It's actually been happening a lot in South Korea as well. So I think one kind of key is that if these places are able to retain many of these qualities as they, as they get more money, quality of life improves. But it doesn't mean that you have to delete. You have to restart it with something a completely imported and solution that's also not working very well.
In your experience in travel, which is the place you have visited that exhibited the best urban design all around? Thank you. That should have been actually part of the presentation. My favorite was Seoul in South Korea. Misha, was that your favorite as well? Maybe you can.
Yeah, I think from places that are kind of current, because I mean, we could also, we could go say, I like the urban form of Paris or I don't know, Venice or something like that better, but these are not places that you could learn from so directly because they've been kind of built a long time ago under very different circumstances. And Seoul and like, I guess Japanese cities are like Tokyo and other South Korean cities are kind of current, and they've been achieving these things very recently and have in some ways a lot more to teach us. And these are like huge like cities of tens of millions of people. So yeah, it's quite a thing.
I hope everyone is convinced to go and book your next vacation. The result after our webinar, like booking came up. Okay, booking numbers. Okay, so you've experienced quite a bit of well-deserved success and press exposure lately. Thank you. Is it becoming easier to find clients that share many of your views, or do you still find it constant battle education process to bring them along? That's a great question. And on the business development side, which is something that I'm in charge of in the company, so the answer is definitely yes. And we also have some filter mechanism in place to make sure that if someone doesn't want smart density, I had someone told me, why didn't you call your company dense density? That's what you want to do. I said, no, absolutely not. And you're not going to be my client. So yes, the answer is good. And I think it speaks to, the marketing of the firm, but it's really our values and what we believe in. And that's why it makes it so easy, because we basically I talk about myself. So I do believe it attracts better clients. And when I say better, I mean a better fit. What would you like to change about public consultation? I think that's a topic for another webinar. I would say, I'll tell you what I can point out in the system. The fact that everything is so heavily political and voted in council, okay, and Vancouver doesn't have it, so they don't have the OMB equivalent, but so they actually need to make decisions. I think once everything is political, so political, this is like purely political, right? And NIMBY's voices are heard and are very strong, because usually what you have in public consultation is the people who object just go, right? It's not, and also not to mention the very thin portion of the population that community open house actually collect their feedback, and there's been lots of research done that young families, if you're hosting a open house at 7 p.m., that's the busiest hour of the day for us, right? So that's just one example. So I would say I don't know what I would change, but I could point out that this system for me has some concerns. Misha, maybe you could would you like to add anything to that, or is that a topic for a webinar?
No, I think the only kind of thing I wanted to add is that one of the issues is that there isn't enough awareness from the participants based on not enough, I think, education, information provided, what the process is actually for and what can be actually achieved, because people would come because they object because something like someone is proposing a tall building where the zoning allows a 4-story building, but actually the official plan already allows it. So there will be maybe a fight over like 5 stories eventually between 30 and 35, which would be like extremely inconsequential to anybody who is involved, but there will be very little discussion about like more like softer aspects of it that are actually like related to what happens at grade, or the uses, and people use their energy to oppose height and density, often not understanding that these things are actually not negotiable because they're already allowed. And as a result, there is much less community involvement. Well, there's a lot of time wasted anyways, but also much less community involvement in things that can actually, that there's actually possible to have impact on.
Misha, there's a really interesting question that I'm actually interested to hear your answer. I work in a small municipality about to become mid-sized with new provincial growth numbers from 30,000 to 80,000 people. We're now undertaking a review of our urban design guidelines to set up for success. What is the number one thing we should implement or keep in mind as we do our guidelines?
Well, that's
no pressure. No
pressure. But I think I don't necessarily have a I don't necessarily have a specific like one great specific proposal. But one thing I would suggest is not starting the process by copying what has been done in other municipalities, which is unfortunately what's usually being done. Because then we get like all over the GTA and beyond, we're getting like angular planes, and we have like this exactly the same tall building guidelines and other aspects that have proved not to work very well in some specific aspects of them. So I think one of them is to start thinking about what you're actually trying to achieve, and I mean on a like granular professional level, not on, I don't mean some big picture, and try to derive it from there. And I suggest also learning from beyond, definitely beyond Toronto or like GTA municipalities, but also from the world, even though it's obviously harder. And I think one good example would be city of Kitchener. So Kitchener and Waterloo, they've done tall building guidelines, and they didn't start with copying what's been done before. They've done something that was both more applicable to their specific circumstances and is just much better. So I think, I just don't think that what we have now, what we have now is maybe better than nothing, but we should be very careful about just replicating.
That's a good advice. Okay, we try to keep our webinars to no longer than 30 minutes to be respectful of your busy days. So I would thank you. There are more questions, so thank you for asking, and thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. Next week, we have a special webinar with the City of Toronto and the City of Vancouver presenting their official plans. That will be an hour long.